Welcome back to Arcade. I am Super Tommy, and in this video, we're going to talk about JavaScript scope and context. Now, we've noted it in our Making Your First Phaser 3 game in Modern JavaScript that if you would like more information about JavaScript scopes, to let us know and we'll give you a deeper dive into it. Now, this was asked by Monk Dream. So thank you, Monk Dream, for asking for more information about JavaScript scopes. So we're going to make this video about that, and we may write up a blog post as well. If you do prefer it written, do let us know, and we'll get that to you faster than we otherwise would. So let's talk about JavaScript scope and contexts. Now, in Phaser here, with this scope and context question came up regarding the this.physics.add.overlap call, where you pass in the two things you want to overlap, a function to call when that happens, a process function, and then this context. That's the last parameter. You see it says this. And so the issue is, why do you need to pass this into the context, and what does it do? So now we're calling it scope. So theoretically, technically, this is a context and not scope, but it is often referred to interchangeably because the two concepts are related. So first, we'll talk about scope before we talk about context to help you understand how JavaScript's scopes work, I guess. I don't know a better way to call it, but effectively, when you create variables, where they go, I've heard of things in like that you can access anywhere that you don't want, global scopes and local scope. So here we have this project. We've just, let me refresh this so that it loads a little better. Okay, so we've got the Phaser logo bouncing on top of the Arcade logo. And the code is very, very simple. It's just two physics images, one is static, and when they overlap each other, we set the velocity to negative 250, y, set velocity y negative 250, so that it has this bouncing effect. Looks like it's sort of floating too, a little bit. So, and you see we have this context here. But first, let's talk about scope. So global scope, you may have heard that you don't want too many things in global scope, and that is true, just because then you don't have local, you can't see it in your code where it is. So it's just like magical things that just exist out there in the ether and you can call it. So global scope is, for example, here I have this name variable set to Super Tommy, and we can actually use it in our Hello World scene. Now, in modern JavaScript, modules are encapsulated. So things you put in here are in its own scope, in the module scope, not in the global scope. So let's first do this console.log name. So like you see, name exists nowhere inside our file here, but you'll see that it shows up here in our console right here. So we're logging out name, but name of course exists nowhere. And here we go. So let's say we do name in our module scope, local to the module, and we say Phaser. And then we log out name, and now it's Phaser. So when you put things inside your global scope, they can be overwritten, and then you lose, if you're expecting to use it, now that is lost. Especially if you use names that are not namespaced at all. So most JavaScript libraries will namespace their globally available references. But it's usually bad to put things into global scope, although still a lot of JavaScript libraries do it this way. That's just how it's always been. And so namespacing is one way to make it better. But you see this could be a problem already. If you're putting all your variables inside the global scope and you don't use modules and you don't encapsulate stuff into its own scope, then you have all these cases where variables change to something else in a different place, and it's very confusing, and bugs will almost certainly arise. So that's global scope, right? When we put anything out here inside the script tags, we have global scope. And by default, most things are in global scope inside, uh, they're just in the global scope by default, usually, unless you use modules or you use functions to encapsulate things together. So now we saw global scope. So in here is module scope, and it's a local to the module. Then, of course, you have in modern JavaScript classes, and there are properties that are local to the class itself. And then you have things that are local to the function. So let's see here. So here, if we refresh, you'll see that it still says SuperTime because we deleted the name variable up here. And so what happens if you create this? We'll call this arcade. Right, naturally, when you log this, it will be arcade. So now the scopes, the innermost scope is the one that takes precedence. So you will shadow variables, as they call it, like when you use the same name for a variable in different scopes, or even within the same scope, you're overriding the variable and you're shadowing it. And you can use ESLint or like a linter to tell you when you're doing that, so you can avoid doing that because it can be confusing, especially if it's like a long function. And then you have a variable called name here, and then further down you use name again, and now you've overridden it, and you may have some other code further down below that expected name to be the original. So there's a lot of messy things can happen, and I think, let's see, it may be that now that I have check.js on, I am not allowed to do this. Yeah, so let's see what this error is, and it says cannot redeclare a block scope variable. Right. Okay, so that's this name. Now we see it's in the create function scope, or the create method scope. Now, if we just create these empty blocks and we log name, right, that's fine. And then we do, right, there's no error, and it's gonna log out phaser. Because these brackets create another scope, right, and another local scope or a lexical scope. And you can declare variables here, and it's going to take precedence over the global or over the parent scope. Now, if we do, I don't know, val3, right? You can reference any variables within the parent scope in the inner local most scope. So we can do log name, and then we can do log val, right? No, print out 3. And you can even adjust it here. So actually they can't because it's val, because it's const. But so you see we have inner parent scope, inner child scope here, the local most scope, just by creating these brackets. And then we have the method scope, and then there's the more global scope on top. So in fact, if we change this to name 2 and get rid of this, or actually let's make this phaser name 3, right? So our global most scope has name as SuperTommy, right? So there we go. As you can see, that's just how JavaScript scoping works, and this is called scoping. So that the variables are scoped within its innermost scope, and you can reference parent variables in the parent scope and other objects and functions as well. So now let's look at how scopes work when we're using functions. So let's say we just make a function here. We're going to call it test. So we've got this function called test. And if we run this, nothing will happen because function is not called. So function here is just declared. And then let's say we immediately call it. Now we're going to get the same thing we had before, right? So SuperTommy is in the global scope. So this function has access to the global scope as well as the parent scope, which is the create method. So val is 3. Now the same things we just did apply. If we set name, naturally we will have overridden name in our own scope, and so we will no longer have access to name in the global scope. So now phaser name is phaser. Now let's do this. So we're going to do console.log this, right? So this is an object which is the scene. So we can see we have, .add, .anims, .events. This is just the scene itself, and we can probably see. Let's see, is there anywhere constructor right here? So the constructor is function hello world scene. So that is our scene here. Now, when you log it out, so we know that this is available in the parent scope of this test function. But now if we log out this in the test function, what we get? Undefined. So we don't get the scene when we're here, right? You can see that we do not get the scene when we are in this function. And so this is where you have to pass in this in physics.add.overlap. So the context changes in a function, even though you're within a class or you're within some other scope. You're like, this is different when you're in a function. Now, let's say we turn this into a lambda, or using the arrow function syntax. So previously with function, we saw this was undefined. Now, this is again the scene. Right, you can see it's the same. We can go down here and we'll see that the constructor is the hello world scene. So you see with the lambda function, it will not override the this context. You can use this as whatever this is that was in the parent scope. And so that's the difference between using a anonymous function in your callbacks versus a lambda. So we'll just get rid of this and this. So now let's take a look at how this works within the context of Phaser. So you're putting it this callback handle overlap inside this .physics.add.overlap. And we specify the context this. So when we're down here and we do console.log this, we will get the scene right there. So here's the scene that we expect because we're in this and we're also in a class. So this all makes sense as expected. Now what we can do, let's say we do some object and we're just going to pass it object. And we're going to pass a context as object and we'll see what we get. And we get object because now we change the this that will be called when the handle overlap callback is called to whatever we passed in as the context. So now you have this context is this object, which is not particularly useful, as you may want in the callback to do, I don't know, this dot add, unless you want to add something else every time it overlaps, and it wouldn't work. So let's just show you. So this dot add, even though VS Code is telling us, yeah, everything is fine, right? Let's just do this. We're going to get an error, right? Because this dot add is undefined, does not exist, because we've now changed the context of this to object that we declared here. Now, what I actually don't know what happens is, can I actually just not put anything in here and then see what Phaser does? Right. So it is going to be called as the context of itself here. If you don't pass in a context, it's going to be called as the context of the function itself. So this is the function. So for example, in JavaScript, this may be a little bit weird for people coming from different languages, but let's just say, in this case, I do this dot name. I am a function. It's not really a name, but let's just say, and then we console log this, and then we console.log this.name, and let's not do this. You'll see that we've given our function a name property effectively. It's read only. Oh, no, I can't use name because function actually has a name property on it. That's which is the name of the function itself. So right, so that's message. And so you see in JavaScript and in the past, before modern ES6 syntax, people would create or make classes in JavaScript in this sort of fashion where they're all functions and you can new a function, which I would recommend that you stick with modern ES6 JavaScript since it looks more like code you may have seen in Java, C# or some other, I don't want to say normal language, but one of those other more traditional languages that you may be coming from or have used in the past. And there's more to these caveats to JavaScript, but we're not going to go over too much of that here. But we will mainly cover how we use it in Phaser and what happens when you change the contexts. Okay. So by and large, you want your context to be this when you're doing modern JavaScript with Phaser. So in the case where this is most likely useful or most often useful is when you are creating a scene as a plain object and you're having your function living outside of it. So for example, we're going to say, right, so let's just say we take this and we're going to make a function outside. Let's see, we're going to just do this. Function handle overlap. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So this should work just fine. And what we're going to do, instead of calling this.overlap, we're going to just do the handle overlap function declared within the module scope here at the very top. And it'll work just fine, right? So we see because it does the same thing. It just, the Phaser logo and Arcade logo are passed in, the two things colliding are passed in. But here's the difference. When we do console.log, this, right? So even though this is a function outside of a class, this is going to be the scene class because we are specifying context to be this. So when we log out this up here, it's going to be the scene, right? This is the same scene object we've been looking at, right? We go to prototype, we'll see this is the hello world scene. Which is how you would allow these functions when you're creating a scene and not in modern ES6 style. If you just make an object that happens to have preload, create, and a bunch of other functions in it, and you declare it that way. In some examples, you'll see this where there's a single file just to like show off Phaser features. You'll see this where there's functions declared in the same file as the game right here, right? So you can make a scene here as just a plain object. Like this, you've probably seen this, and then you pass in preload, you pass in create, blah, blah, blah. And then up here is where preload and create is. And you can also give it different variables here, like, name, and then you say some scene. And you want to access that. The only way to do that is to pass in as the context a reference to this scene object. So, but we're not gonna do this. Let's just undo. Okay. So going back here, so this is this, and just so that you can see the difference when we don't pass in this as the context, and we log it out, it is again the function itself. So it is this the function itself, and obviously we can't access the rest of the scene here. So if we, for some reason, wanted to, again, this .add.image at 300, 300, the arcade logo, it would simply not work. Missing a comma. And error. So that is the basics of scopes and context in JavaScript as it relates to Phaser. So generally speaking, we recommend you use modern JavaScript when you're writing phaser games. It just saves you a bunch of headache, and you don't generally have to think about what you pass in for context in almost anywhere. So you'll see context in tweens, for sure. I've definitely seen them in tweens and other places I can think of, but definitely tweens for the complete callback or the update callback or the start callback, I believe. And you'll pass in a function, and you may need to access the scene for properties you put on the scene. So you got to give it this as the scope. In those cases, it's called scope. So, as we can see, we often interchange the use of scope and context, even though they're not exactly the same, but they're used interchangeably. So that is the basics. Let me know in the comments below if you have any other questions. This topic is somewhat complicated, and JavaScript doesn't make it too much easier since there's a lot of caveats and different things. We haven't even covered some of the more old school, like IIFEs, I think. I don't remember the exact. Let me just look it up here. But they're like the instantaneous functions that get called immediately, and you create its own scope. This is very old JavaScript tricks for encapsulating and like having private data within an object that you return, so you don't let other people modify your object, and potentially break something because they're from the outside changing stuff in the data that you need for your code. So there's all kinds of other tricks that JavaScript developers have created over the years before we've had modern JavaScript syntax that gives you safety. But now we are in 2020, and modern JavaScript is usable in all modern browsers with no tooling whatsoever. So definitely use modern JavaScript, and you'll save yourself a lot of headache on errors that come from this stuff. Here's what you mostly need to know. When you're using a context or a scope that phaser needs, it almost always is going to be this if you're using modern JavaScript. But you do know you can change it to something else, and what that does is changes the this in any function that will be called. And that's basically it. Let me know if you have questions in the comments below, and thanks for watching.